Good morning, church. Big day today. Today is Grandparent Day. Could I have all grandparents raise their hands? Yeah. You're a grandparent? Nice. I wanted to know why you didn't come up and brush my hair with your brush. You didn't want to brush my hair? No? Okay. Grandparents. Grandparents are amazing. My first line about being a grandparent is that if I knew that grandkids would be so much fun, I would have had them first. That's my line. But when you go from there, the next thing you do is you go into the Bible and you look for something about grandparents in the Bible, and I went to 17:6. And Proverbs 17:6 says, "Grandchildren are the crown of the aged." Simple, but it's true. When you sit there and you look at your kids are kind of like that one generation down that you just beat for 16 years and you send them out on the road, right? But the grandkids, they visit, and you get to nurture them in a completely different style. And for us, it's our grandparents our grandchildren showed us that we did a pretty good job with our kids because they're raising some good kids on their own. So for all grandparents here, I applaud you for A, surviving, for B, for getting to enjoy the moment as a grandparent. Today, I picked the topic of fear, which has nothing to do with being a grandparent. Well, sometimes it does. But actually, before I go there, I want to say one. I want to do an unabashed plug. Monday night for the Bible study, for adult Bible study, Monday night we're going to do an actual study. It's going to be a 4-week study of Acts 7. And by a study is that I'm going to bring in commentaries, a dictionary, a Hebrew dictionary, multiple versions of a Bible, and as a group, we're going to go deep into Acts and find out what's written, why it's written, how it can be interpreted. So at the end of 4 weeks, anybody in the group should be able to turn around, if they had that kind of skill, should be able to turn around and give a lesson on Acts 7 on what it's all about, how it's there, how it relates to the Old Testament. So it's a 4-week deal. We're going to take one chapter of Acts and spend 4 weeks driving down using a whole ton of references in order to figure out what's going on in that particular chapter. So anybody who likes to study, who likes to read, who wants to grow just one more level in your study of the Bible, 4 weeks for Acts 7. And now I'll go into fear, which that in itself probably could have caused you some anxiety and trepidation going, I have to read a what? A concordance? Yeah, you do. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through a couple of things, and I picked fear for a number of reasons. One is what we're coming up on inside Ephesians, which we're going to be covering next. And then when we return to Acts, there's a couple deals that talks about fear and the reaction to fear. So there are many definitions of fear, and I figured that what I would like to do is to go through and do a message on fear and what fear is all about. And it starts with Proverbs 9, verse 10. And it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." And this is an important verse because we're not treating fear as something run away and hide. That fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And when we address the fear of the Lord, fear as in shaking, you can, but shaking fear as in being scared in the night by the boogeyman, this is a fear as in an understanding of the awesomeness of God. So it's a fear of understanding, which leads to wisdom. And then I jump over to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 7. And it's, again, a short one, and it just says, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." So when we go through this message of fear, I don't want you to walk away saying that I am fearsome of something. I want you to look at that good side of fear and what that fear can develop in you. And the Proverbs verse says that it gives you wisdom. And in Timothy, it talks about power and love and self-control. So fear, for me, is a good thing. And I go to the second slide, and just to show you that the names in the Bible aren't the only names that are hard to pronounce, this quote is from a Reverend Dr. Bogomil Jarmalak, and I am not going to repeat that. So the Grand Reverend says that the lack of fear leads to lack of inhibitions, to thoughtlessness, carelessness, sluggishness, and arrogance. Life without fear, like life without pain, would expose us to unidentified dangers. For me, this is a life-centered moment because so many people try to avoid fear and run away from fear and try and justify things or hide from things that they fear. The Grand Reverend says, no, fear, if you avoid fear and have no fear, you will have issues because that will lead to things that aren't part of your developmental style, developmental steps in becoming a better person. It leads to inhibitions, thoughtfulness, carelessness, sluggishness, and arrogance. We don't want those things in our life. But what fear does is fear strengthens us and drives us on a path that will avoid those bad habits. And I'll leave it at the word as habits. So the Grand Reverend also says that fear is a good thing. So let's march through the Bible and look up some things. The next slide, Adam, is from Matthew 14. And Matthew 14, as a reminder, there's a section, there's other things that happen. 14, there's the death of John the Baptist, Jesus feeding the 5,000, and then there's Jesus walks on water. And Jesus walking on water in itself is not really a story about fear. It's a story about how Jesus loves his disciples so much, he's willing to do something out of the ordinary, to use one of his miracle walks, to get to the boat to help them out. But what I want to emphasize in here is verse 16, and that really isn't where I wanted to go. So I'm looking through again, 16. Yep, nope, it's not 16 at all, sorry. So Jesus walks on water, and I'm going to scan through. What happened is the storm came, and the men in the boat, they were in the boat, and they were scared from the storm, and they thought surely they were going to die. And they looked out, and they see Jesus walking across the water towards them. And how do they react? And I got there, and it's verse 26, not 16, verse 26. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Now this is a person, Jesus, walking towards them that they've hung around with for at least a year at this point, year and a half. And they saw him, and the reaction was one of fear because they didn't understand. They weren't scared of Jesus. They were scared of the fact that they saw Jesus doing that they didn't expect him to be able to do. And that fear encompassed them. They froze up as a result of that fear. But through the fear, when Jesus said, "Don't be afraid, it's really me," through that fear, then Peter turns around and says, "Well, if it's really you, tell me to come out and walk to you in the water." He went through the fear to one of immediate acceptance of who he was and what he should be able to do. So you see, Peter saw the fear, was afraid, but then got through the fear in order to do something that none of the disciples have done, which I'm sure if I was Peter, over and over again, whenever something was happening, well, you guys didn't walk on water. So he would probably hold that over them. I'm going to jump to 2 Chronicles, Old Testament, chapter 20, which is another story of fear, based on fear. And the story is about King Jehoshaphat. And King Jehoshaphat, I'll just pick verse 3, and it says, "Then Jehoshaphat was afraid and set his face to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah." He was afraid of what was happening. There were 4 other tribes that were starting to surround him, and they were ready to go to war. And when Jehoshaphat looked out and saw all these people, he said, "We're going to get whooped. We're going to get beat down." And he was afraid. He had a fear that was rattling in his boots. The fear of attack was putting him in a situation where he wasn't able to make good decisions. That fear was freezing him up. He didn't know what to do specifically, but he knew who to go to. And he went to God. He went to God in prayer. And there's this whole section in that chapter where he prays to God and said, "I don't know how to handle this. God, you need to help me. I need to know what to do and how to do it." And God turned around and said, explain to him how faithful a king he has been. And said, "You don't need to be afraid because I've got your back. I am there for you. I'm ready to cover you." God gave an assurance of victory. I went to verse 15-ish. See if I'm right this time. And he said, "Listen, all Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem and King Jehoshaphat, thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid and do not be dismayed at this great horde, for the battle is not yours, but God's." The battle is not yours, but God's. Your lesson learned there is that when you're in a tough situation, pray. God will calm you, reassure you, and allow you to go into the battle with him at your back. Sometimes he'll be in the front, but he will be there in order to help you through whatever the instance is that you are afraid of. As a result of the faithfulness at the beginning, the prayer, then the response, there was an awesome victory. Jehoshaphat's armies won the battle. But notice the sequence. There was faith before there was prayer. And that's what we need to be able to reach back to when we do our prayer, is that we're not praying to a stranger, we are praying to someone that we have a relationship with. And that, for me, is the key in that entire sequence, is the fact that the prayers were not random prayers, the prayers were based on faith. I move on to a fear of failure. And in the fear of failure, I go through 3 different references. But the first one I picked out was in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8. And it goes like this: "And the officers shall speak further to the people and say, is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own."